Index by Segnalibro, le interviste di Giulia Carla De Carlo. Benvenuti ad Index by Segnalibro, la rubrica che sviscera i temi più importanti dei vostri libri preferiti in compagnia degli autori e delle autrici. Oggi avremo con noi dalla casa editrice Fazi una scrittrice, una poetessa e una traduttrice britannica, Amy Blakemore.
Hello, Segnalibro.
Welcome to Italy.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here.
Le streghe di Manningtree parlano di una storia vera. Perché hai sentito l'esigenza di dover narrare questa storia?
There's not a shortage of books about historical witch trials, but with this specific story and the witch trials that happened in England, I felt that very often the literature around the witch trials and novels about the witch trials sort of flattened the complexity of what was happening in those situations. My dad is from he lives in Manningtree. So it was an element of history I felt quite a personal connection to.
Perché hai deciso di narrare questa vicenda in prima persona attraverso gli occhi di Rebecca?
So actually there was a first draft of the novel which I'd written in third person. And I ended up changing that kind of quite late in the writing process. And I think overall, the first person perspective was generating more of that feeling. It ended up feeling more oppressive. And that was what I wanted, to create that feeling of oppression and restriction and the idea of things going on around you and going on kind of over your head that you didn't know about and didn't really know how to stop. So I think having a more limited perspective on the events that are depicted in the book sort of served the purpose of generating that feeling of dread and constriction that sort of mirrored what I imagine being accused of being a witch in the 17th century might have felt like. So I'm very glad I made the decision to change the perspective at the last minute. Yeah.
Chi erano le donne che venivano considerate streghe, le perseguitate?
A witch trial looked different wherever it happened. They obviously happened kind of all across Europe, and in Catholic countries and in Protestant countries. And what a witch was meant to look like was also different in all of those different countries, what a witch was meant to do. That means that there aren't really that many things that all of the people who were accused of being witches had in common. In Scandinavian countries, it was more often men who were accused of being witches than women, which is kind of an interesting historical aberration. But overall, across Europe, it tended to be gendered and it tended to be women who were targeted. And while there's no generalizations we can make about all of these women and men, there are some things they tended to have in common. Usually, or most often, they were poor and they lived at the margins of whatever communities they existed within, which meant they maybe didn't have access to sort of protection through justice that maybe the wealthier or more socially elite women might have had. So they weren't able to protect themselves against being accused. They were, most of them, probably illiterate. So they didn't necessarily have access to information or legal representation, or their horizons were quite limited in some ways. Very often they were older women. They were women that we now might think of as disabled, although sort of the language around disability was very, very different then. And things that we would now understand to be disabilities, they maybe wouldn't have. And something else that a lot of them have in common is, for whatever reason, because in peasants and sort of, working communities, particularly rural working, countryside working communities where everyone had to work to kind of shift their share. Another thing that very often they would have in common is that they were women who, for whatever reason, weren't able to do that anymore or weren't perceived to be contributing to the community through rearing children or through labouring in the fields. So like elderly women, for instance, unmarried women, widows. So yes, they were women who had something about them that made them other, that made them different from most of the women in their communities. That's perhaps one thing we could say they all had in common. Yeah.
Chi è Messer Hopkins? È un uomo realmente esistito che affermava che Satana risiedeva nelle menti delle persone ignoranti, è un affabulatore, è carismatico. Chi era Messer Hopkins?
So Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, is kind of quite a notorious figure in English history. He's kind of difficult to talk about in terms of fact because he's one of those historical figures where 400 years on, it's quite hard, or nearly 400 years on, it's quite hard to separate what was actually true about him from the stories and the myths that have grown up around him since. What we do know is that he was a Puritan, probably a Calvinist, which is a really extreme sect of Puritan Protestant Christianity. So he was a very, very religious man and a very restrictive type of Christianity. And he was very young when he began his career hunting witches. He was just in his mid-20s. He was from a village called Greater Wenham, which is in Suffolk in the south of England. He quite possibly had some sort of legal training, but as you say, he was very definitely, he must have been incredibly charismatic in order to attract the kind of support he did. Basically, the job he would do would be, he would be invited to communities who suspected that there were witches living in their midst, and he would be paid to aid in the investigations. He pioneered and designed all these techniques for finding witches, which obviously appear, you know, superstition and absolute hokum to us now. That was his career. He wrote a book about finding witches, and then his career ended quite interestingly and quite suddenly because he began to meet a lot of resistance. He travelled across sort of all the south of the UK and up into the Midlands to places like Northampton. And over the course of, I think it was only really a year and a half, a couple of years, he was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of people, most of them women. And then his career, it ends quite suddenly because people start to question his techniques. And then he died at the age of 27, probably of consumption, tuberculosis. So very, very interesting guy. I think he's one of those sort of eternal mysteries because we will never know if, you know, according to the Bible, what he was doing was right. He was following the word of God. He was following the commandments of the Bible. But he also profited by it. And we will never know whether he genuinely believed that what he was doing was right. And that was kind of one of the mysteries, I suppose, in the book that I wanted to explore.
Modestia, ubbidienza, mansuetudine, sono queste le virtù richieste alle donne. Siamo davvero fuori da questo stereotipo?
I think in a way, obviously, we have progressed entirely from the time when the Bible and theology and religious texts kind of dictated gender relations, I should say, in the way they did in the 17th century. Certainly in Europe, certainly in the West. But I think it can be very easy to feel like and to act as though we have won all the battles. But I don't think that's true as well. You know, things can move backwards as well as forwards. And sadly, what we're seeing in the world is that in some places, maybe even most places, we are moving backwards. You know, there's been a backlash against the relative liberation that many women are beginning to enjoy and experience. So while I wouldn't go so far as to say that kind of the Manningtree witches and Puritan repression of women and female sexuality is a taste of things to come, I do think that it's worth us as women, well, as people, all people, paying attention to the way that oppression, and especially oppression of women, has functioned in the past, has functioned historically, because it teaches us how to resist it now.
Possiamo dire che il tuo libro è femminista?
So I never know how I feel about the label of feminist book, because I am a feminist and I have written a book that, you know, is generated by my politics in that sense. But I feel like if you call something a feminist book, then men don't want to read it. And I would hope it's a story for everyone, I suppose. Oh, and it's stupid that men wouldn't want to read a book that's labelled a feminist book, but, you know, kind of that's what might happen. I am a feminist, and it's a book driven by those politics, but I think it's a book about oppression and social violence and the process by which people on the margins of society are driven further out, that's relevant to lots of different political struggles, I suppose.
Le donne, quando pensano da sole, pensano male. Perché gli uomini avevano così paura delle donne?
So that's a quote from the Malleus Maleficarum, which was, or the Hammer of the Witches in English, which was a guide to witch hunting that was written by two German monks in the 16th century. And it was a really, really popular book across Europe. Lots of witch hunters sort of took the Malleus Maleficarum as their guidebook. And it's a really, really sexist and misogynist text, obviously, from that quote you can see. But I think that quote gets at something really interesting about how witch trials were driven by fear, and fear of the unknown, and especially fear of what was unknown in women. Because I think ultimately one of the reasons the sort of oppression of women that Puritan communities wanted to enact will always fail is that your mind is always yours. No matter how much your father or your brother or the patriarchs in your community want to control you, they can never control where your brain goes, where your imagination goes. I think the essential fear at the heart of a lot of witch trials is this idea that you never know what's going on in her head. You never know what dark or hateful thoughts she might be having. And I think that terror of the unknowability of women, these men couldn't understand women, and because they couldn't understand them, they wanted to control them. And if they couldn't control them and they couldn't understand them, they wanted to get rid of them. So yeah, I think it speaks to how accusing someone of being a witch was ultimately because you were scared of her, because you knew she had a power that you couldn't understand. And that power wasn't necessarily witchcraft. It wasn't necessarily literally magic. But it was still there, yeah.
Ho notato alcuni orpelli stilistici che appartengono a un'Inghilterra di quel periodo. A chi ti sei ispirata? Quali sono stati gli scrittori di riferimento o le opere di riferimento?
It was important for me that the Manningtree witches borrowed some of the language and the colour of the 17th century English literary tradition, and I studied early modern English literature at university, and I really loved those texts and I really loved that language and that colour. Quite foundational to my research was reading those texts, and Paradise Lost by John Milton was quite foundational, and also the King James Bible. So it felt really important to me. You know, Puritans, they thought in Bible verses. Their imaginative frame of reference came from the Bible. The way they related to each other was through Bible stories and, you know, the stories of Jesus. And they also used that kind of apocalyptic and fiery language, you know, in the pulpit, in the pamphlets that they read and shared. So I always had the Bible next to me when I was writing it, because that was the way these people understood their world. So yeah, the Bible. but the sort of the King James Bible was, you know, not the earliest, but it was the first widely available vernacular English translation of the Bible that everyone could have bought a copy of and had in their home. And it was a relatively new thing at the time the witch trials were happening. It'd only been out for a few decades. So suddenly everyone had access to the Bible for the first time. And the ideas in it were really fascinating to people.
Abbiamo detto che il tuo romanzo parte da documenti storici. Come hai lavorato da un punto di vista storico?
We have, fortunately, quite full records how the trials of the women who were accused in Manningtree went down and what people said about them and what they said about each other. So I had those resources to work with. I wanted to stay as close as I could to the records that we have, but those pamphlets that are about the trials of these women, they were kind of mass media. They were sort of like the tabloid newspapers of their time. So they're sensationalized and they're designed to entertain their readers. So you also have kind of a bit of leeway to play with those sources as well, because they're already not necessarily wholly accurate. I tried to stay as close as possible to them, but they're quite mad things to stay close to anyway. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Index by Segnalibro, le interviste di Giulia Carla De Carlo.